As the translator Kit Schluter points out, it could be described as a kind of neurotic erotica, leading him to coin the term neurotica. Better than food, man. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. Oh, that is absolutely delicious. Quick note, as of January 1st, 2024, the $1 tier on Patreon shall be deleted and the lowest buy-in shall be $5. I'll make announcement reminders periodically on the show and on Patreon as we near the date. It's the first time ever that I've raised a price on the history of this channel, but you all know how it is out there with inflation these days, wherever you are in the world, and that is terrible. And in fact, this was one of the worst areas for it in the entire country, here in Tampa Bay, Florida, apparently. So if you're a current patron in the $1 tier, don't panic yet. If you don't have a monthly cap set, like a monthly limit, you're probably donating somewhere between like $1 to $4 a month every month anyways. So if you join the $5 tier, but you set your monthly limit to $5, it really may not make much of a difference. Thank you very much for understanding, and thank you very much for your continued support. It really helps, because it's bad out there. On to the review. All right, so this is exciting. Today is Dead End by the French author Michel Surya. Published today, as a matter of fact, from the indie press Black Sun Lit. Very cool guys. Thanks for the book. I'm partially sponsored by them today in that they sent me this book for free. Excellent book for Halloween season. This is pretty niche, but you know, for me it's kind of exciting. This is Bataille's Biographer, the guy who wrote Georges Bataille, an intellectual biography, and that's the English title. The French one is different. It was originally published in 1987, but it's a magnificent biography. It won the Prix Goncourt for that year in biography in France. And magnificent book. It really made me fall in love with Bataille's work and him, you know, as a mind and all these things. But Surya is an excellent author, and he writes fiction himself. And this is the first work of his fiction that has been published in English. And it happens to be translated by my friend, Kit Schluter, who lives in Mexico City and was responsible for the great translation of the Book of Manel, amongst many others. Great translator, really cool guy, very funny. He has his own novel coming out, novel slash book of illustrations. Like, it's interesting. I don't know what you'd call it exactly. It's curious. It's called Cartoons. It looks really interesting. It's coming out from City Lights, the publisher in San Francisco, in 2024. I'll be reviewing that on the show, I'm sure. But yeah, very cool guy and excellent translator. And he just keeps proving that over and over again. So, you know, when worlds collide, it's pretty damn cool. So I recommend you grab a copy quick, because it is, on top of being a great book, I mean, look at this thing. This is a beautiful cover, and you like how it matches my friend on the shelf? That's pretty awesome. Completely unintentional, by the way. I just love the color, the dark burnt red here on the front with the Vanitas painting, which is very intentional, and we'll discuss that. Very small, very short little book. But it is the most powerful short one that I've read this year, excluding Suddenly Last Summer by Tennessee Williams, which is a short play. The French author Michel Surya is probably the world's foremost expert on Georges Bataille, who is the author of Story of the Eye, amongst many other very interesting titles of fiction and philosophy. So Dead End was originally published in French in 2010 under the title L'Impasse, The Impasse, right? Dead End is a great title, in my opinion. So this is the first work of fiction by Michel Surya to appear in English. It's a short work of experimental, pornographic, or erotic fiction that feels much longer than it actually is, composed of a single sentence spanning 51 pages. Very little punctuation. The first-person narrator is presumably addressing the woman he's involved with in a confessional divesting, right? Exposing all of his inner thoughts, insecurities, desires, fears, hopes, wishes, philosophical ideas. It's a meditation on carnality, emotionality, and mortality. Definitely poetic, conjuring tones of, you know, Baudelaire or Rimbaud. If you'd like to support the show, a great way of doing that would be buying one of these mugs, and you can find the link for that in the description box below. There's a little illustration of a skeleton reading a book here, done by my friend Sky. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. It reminded me a bit of the Brazilian author Radwan Nassar's A Cup of Rage, which I reviewed a few years ago, maybe three years ago or so. Beautiful book. But of course, what this one is, one would expect, it's much more Bataille. That is like macabre, more of an explicit fusing of the ideas of sex and death. It's beautiful in its all-encompassing morbid solipsism. It's very unusual. It's not as raw as perhaps it may sound coming from me. It's not. Yes, it's pornographic. It's erotic. technically, right? But it's not abrasive, it's not vulgar per se, in my opinion. I mean, it's not squeamish, that's for sure, but it's not, it isn't even like Bataille necessarily. It's not like Madame Edwarda or The Dead Man or Story of the Eye even. I mean, you can spot Bataille for sure, without question. I mean, obviously, he was his biographer, but Surya is much more, what would you call it? Not polite, but he's warmer. That's the word that gets closest, yeah. As the translator Kit Schluter points out, it could be described as a kind of neurotic erotica, leading him to coin the term neurotica, which the back description suggests could be a whole genre in itself. Cerebral eroticism, right? From this description, which humorously sounds like it could be both of William Gibson and or Woody Allen, you can get a feel for the tone and content of the book. Now, I will say, it's pornographic only in that it is obviously a work dealing explicitly with the sexual act and eroticism, but I wouldn't call it smutty or vulgar. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like, how would you call something pornographic but not smutty, you know? But it's true. Mostly it's kind of cerebral and existential, traveling, meandering through a labyrinthine maze of thought. And there's fair room to debate whether or not anything actually occurs at all, or whether it's not just an elongated thought during or about sex. In the afterword by Schluter, Surya is quoted, comparing pornography, and thus Dead End, to the Vanitas paintings, one of which graces the cover of this book. These paintings which were kind of dealt with the, death, the finality of human life. But yeah, I was comparing pornography to Vanitas paintings in its cerebralization of the body. I'll read that to you now. I thought it was really interesting. Great afterword. This is Surya's quote. The erotic, though I would rather say the pornographic, takes after another genre, an old genre that doesn't exactly belong to literature. It belongs, and quite closely, to painting. To vanitas, pure cerebrality, completely contrary to what one would first imagine, It's a question of cerebralizing the body, not of pornographizing thought. If there's a ceremony in Dead End, it's the ceremony of this cerebralization. And Kit explains, this way of looking which cerebralizes the flesh, and so keeps mortality always in the frame, underlies Michel Surya's Dead End as well. A work of pornography in all appearances, Surya's book is ultimately not so much about sex per se as it is about the anxiety, a certain strain of male-bodied anxiety, of the sex act. A mixture that might be called neurotica. Its allegiance is to the expressly cerebral side of sex, the side which never escapes language and thought, and which so often goes unexpressed. This is one of the rare times where I'm actually going to suggest you read the afterword first before you read the book. It's a really good primer. There's a nice foreword as well by the French poet Amandine André, who I believe was the one who originally introduced Kit to this book. The author divulges all of his thoughts and feelings in a deluge of extreme confession, not unlike Clarice Lispector's The Passion According to G.H., or the work of Samuel Beckett, particularly The Unnameable. Highly claustrophobic, neurotic, hyper-focused fire hose of anxiety in words and language. It's as though he's trying as hard as he can to get to the origin, the source, right, of his thought. To kind of communicate the pure sexual experience, trying to communicate the sexual experience in an all-encompassing way, to get everything that he's experiencing that's going through his mind in the process of the act, and the consequences of the act and what the act means, everything, all at once. It's as if he's trying to communicate all of that to the person he's experiencing this with, to the person he's having sex with. Not only the physicality of everything, but also the emotional and philosophical meaning of everything. To express in the purest terms possible, the most accurate terms possible, what he feels. Because there, like the sexual act, or so it seems he thinks if he can get there, there will be a respite from the anxiety that is life, that is normal living, normal life. The oasis of climax and the brief satisfaction longed for in this torrential sea of violent thought and action and strife and suffering. The entire book is composed of one single sentence that begins without fanfare and is cut off by dozens of periods suggesting either an actual physical death, the death of the mind, or an orgasm. Perhaps all three. Fine way to go, if you ask me. There is no punctuation, and in an interesting translator move, mimicking the French of the original, Kit has decided to use lowercase i's, as in like I am and so on, which reflect the subtlety of the French je. There's no capital J, right? In English, the capital I dominates the page in its drawing attention to itself in nearly every sentence. But when you remove that, there's something really interesting that happens to the text. It kind of flattens it out to some degree, which makes it more subtle. Yeah, it's really interesting. So I'll give you an idea of what this book sounds like. This is hard to read out loud. It's hard to read in your head, too. I'll tell myself on the day when I'm taken in at last by one final motion, which I once imagined would put an end to all other motions, cut them off. I'll tell myself that it's from yourself. You're pulling out from yourself, you are disappearing, you'll die no differently than you'll have loved, you'll have been no less alone, nor less unhappy. You are every solitude and unhappiness which you sought, but never felt. Dying requires more loneliness and unhappiness than we've ever shown elsewhere. It takes being with our bodies, which must be reduced to nothing in ways we've never done with any body. We've never been able to reduce to nothing, no matter how badly we may have acted with it, no matter how badly we may have acted with anyone at all. Still, we've never behaved so badly that anyone didn't deserve to exist except for us. That was in italics. If we want to die, will we ever know how to behave badly enough with ourselves that nothing remain of what we've chosen to remove from existence? I no longer feared the day when dying wouldn't seem impossible anymore. I wanted it for so long. I wanted dying not to seem impossible to me someday. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough to bring on death itself. I didn't die. I never died. I never had enough of my death. If we want the day to exist, if we truly want the day to return, we must leave the night. She and I act as if nothing existed but the night on which we met and held each other. We ourselves are that night on which we met and held each other. And what we're afraid of is that the day not be given back to us, like I give back to you the clothes I took off you. I help you put them back on. I'm shaking, my hands are shaking, giving them back to you, putting them back onto you. Better to forget the night into which we tried to disappear, forget we didn't have the strength to make the night make us disappear. I'm shaking from being alone, you're shaking from being alone, your body has no more flesh than a wall. Honestly, it's my own flesh that resembles a wall. And I'm just gonna stop there. And it just keeps going on and on and on. It's exhausting. It builds this momentum, right? It's very similar to Beckett in that it builds that momentum, that kind of speed, because there are no periods, there's no commas, there's no nothing until the end. Maybe that's what life is like. Maybe that's meant to mimic life. I mean, that in and of itself mimics the sexual act, right? Building up and gaining speed and gaining intensity up until the climax, and then like life itself, and then death. There's that repose. So the very construction of the book, the way it's written, actually mimics the sexual act, as well as life itself, which of course leads to death. What was most moving about the book for me was the meditation it conjured on the idea of being in love with someone, with another, but separate, which is a very Bataille theme, with being in tune with another individual, to love them so much, and to lose yourself in this intense act of physicality, but to never quite cross that threshold that separates you, like, into each other, right? To be the same being, even though it feels at moments as though you have. That's the final tragedy of love. I mean, it's final, the primary, you know? To always have that tragic separation as individuals, that tragic barrier, right? My death is not your death, no matter how much I wish it to be, no matter how much I want it to be, no matter how much we'd like to console each other in the merging of our fate, right? The impossibility of an erotic synthesis, of a coalescence that is nonetheless intensely desired. That desire that is constantly renewed in us for as long as we live, as long as we are capable of desiring, right? Even when our body fails, you know, the mind, that's where all this really happens, right? That's what's very interesting about the book, is it really shows that. It really demonstrates that it's the mind is the erotic tool. Not to belittle the physical, which is extremely powerful, but when you combine the two, you have something, this machine that can go in all these directions. It's really something. There's something religious about it, or maybe we should employ Bataille's term, sacred. Something deep and ancient and permanent, or true, right? Impossible for one person to become another, and yet we start off in that place. We start off as part of another. We start off in the womb as part of another person. We're born from others, and indeed, at first, we are part of another. So where do you stop and start, right? Where do you begin and end? I like the historical timeline of this book, as it demonstrates that while we may have an idea burst forth and we capture it in our notes in a moment of inspiration, it could take years, decades, the changing of a millennia before the work actually becomes something. From the back of this book's description, Surya apparently wrote a draft of what became this book in 1985. Almost 20 years later, it was discovered with his papers in 2004 and revised in 2006. Then it was published in 2010 in French, and then 13 years later, it was published in 2023 in English. So this book is 38 years in the making from its original inception, since the original draft in 1985. Don't throw away those notes. Unsurprisingly, the author the book feels most indebted to is the author that Surya dedicated a significant portion of his life to studying, Georges Bataille. And this book has moments where it feels similar to Bataille's works of experimental confessional philosophy, let's call it. The titles I'm thinking of are Guilty and Inner Experience, both translated by Stuart Kendall. Particularly Guilty. That's the one that feels closest to this book. It was written during I think, World War II. It's kind of Bataille's World War II journal. And it's very dark, as you could guess. Inner Experience, I remember less of. Great books, very distinct and peculiar works. I highly recommend you read them. The first time I read Guilty, I basically underlined the whole book while I was doing research for Story of the Eye. People ask what happened to that project, and it's not particularly dramatic. It's pretty much what you'd expect. Couldn't find the money, so that is on hold. Probably indefinitely, but who knows. I love this book. I love books that allow for the mind to go off on spindly, fragile trails of thought, like the afterimage of fireworks, often going nowhere, but suggesting a path, if one wanted to. And with Surya's book, one certainly could. You could start going down an intellectual rabbit hole with all kinds of things. There's a lot of paths opened up, filled with notions firing off like synaptic processes of the mind. Very, very much like the mind when one is having sex. But it's a gorgeous Styxian river of thought. It really gave me this feeling of sadness when thinking about our behavior during the night, our nocturnal behavior. You know, this desperate, like, carnivorous, voracious appetite for something to feel explicitly different from what we experience during the day. To satiate desire and often, for a moment, to become someone else than who we are during the daytime, which is often less than desired. To become something else, you know, the shadow life, the dark side, the momentary fleeting death of the rational and the responsible. That's what sex destroys, after all, and that's what Bataille knew. The productive, utilitarian side of us is obliterated, and within that experience remains something sacred and otherworldly, something that connects us to the most ancient explosion of stars from which we crawled, right? You guys ought to check out Nick Land's Thirst for Annihilation. That's a good one. He's a guy who also really knew Bataille. But yeah, all of that within Surya's little book, right? Which is not totally Bataille, but close enough to spot, right? Surya is warmer than Bataille. Very similar, again, to Beckett and Lispector. Maybe Huysmans, like Là-Bas or Against Nature. It's like a decadent feeling I get when reading it, but this writing is so economically stripped down that it's like the opposite of decadent writing. But it does have that kind of fantasy poetic tone, like Rimbaud, Baudelaire, that kind of thing. It reminds me a little bit of the poetry of Nina Power, actually. She writes poetry on her Substack. There's a book of her poetry called Platforms, which I reviewed for patrons a few years ago. Reminds me of that a little bit. And there's a very farewell quality to the book. Lonely, again, tragic, quiet, sad, final. Somewhere inside there, he communicated the true feeling, horrifyingly brief in terms of the universe, of true love, of the desire to share, and not only to share, to dissolve, to disappear into, to die into and fuse, melt, and become one with the beloved. That feeling which is fragile, like our narrator, like us and our loves, like all of us and our loves. No matter how strong we feel they may be, they are, indeed, wholly fragile, more than we would ever want to contemplate. It's a true horror story in that respect, a deeply frightening gaze at our own vulnerability, at our impermanence and susceptibility to forces outside our control, things that will rupture our ties with the beloved, our ability to love them, whether because of age or health, and our ties, finally, with ourselves. It will rupture our ties with ourselves, these forces outside of our control, because we die. We lose a person we love, we lose the ability to love them, and then we die. This is the story of every single human life that has ever lived, ever. You know, the loss of control is another theme. I mean, like you could read into in that book. I mean, just the in every way, sex and death really are beyond our control. That's what makes them powerful and terrifying. Those are two elements that are so radically opposed to being subjected to human control that, you know, they dominate our species. Those two elements, they forever. They are uncontrollable. They are what shapes all of this. So, the book is a wonderful demonstration of the power of minimalism in literature. Everything is stripped down. It's concerned with arguably the two most important things in the human experience, sex and death. It's not particularly raunchy or vulgar, nothing like Sade or Guyotat or even J.G. Ballard. It's more reserved than all of them. Appropriately, it seems. He's got class, this Surya guy. It's certainly not timid, and it is explicit, but it's almost as if that's an afterthought, right? Again, it's like the Nassar book. It's like, okay, we're reading about a man having sex. Fine. But he, the man, is thinking about death in this all-encompassing stream of thought, while possibly engaged in the act itself, where all his guards are down, where he can't protect himself any longer. And that's powerful. That's where the truth of things is revealed, when our guard is down. Forcefully, organically removed in a chaotic exchange of energy. The dark nudity of the soul. That's the mind when it's having sex, right? I'd say if you don't blush too much at the premise and category, you may find something really moving in here. A fine follow-up to The Hellbound Heart. Great bang for your buck, no pun intended. Minimal time investment with poetic, heavy philosophical dividends. So you should read it. I think by now you know if it's for you or not. Again, if you like the work of Clarice Lispector, Samuel Beckett, and Georges Bataille, highly recommend it. Right up your alley. Better than food. Check it out. Coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take the names of all the patrons on Patreon who have donated $5 or more per video to the show, I place them in this mason jar, and for every review I do, I pull out a name, and whoever's name I pull out is sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And the coffee is delicious. Currently it's from Nicaragua. It's one of my favorites I've ever roasted. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, you can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/books-are-better-than-food and donate $5 or more per video. And I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much. You can join the $1 tier and get access to a bunch of cool stuff listed below, but like I said in the beginning, that's going to be phased out and shall end on the 1st of January in 2024. So might I suggest the $5 tier, which will get you in the jar. Also, international shipping is included. Thank you very much to all my patrons for your continued support. It really means a lot. Best of luck to you. Okay, here we go. David S. Thank you very much, David. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive Dead End by Michel Surya, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And I hope you love both as much as I. Cheers. And thank you very much to Black Sunlit for sending me this book. Excellent work again, Kit Schluter. Please go check out the rest of his books. Please subscribe and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember, die reading. All right, take care of yourselves. Have a great night. Happy Halloween. Talk to you soon. Ciao.